Hi everybody, Dr. Carrillo here, and welcome to your next discussion board topic. I'm going to be going over missing requirements, warnings, tips, and whatnot, so make sure that you are taking very careful notes as we go through the information presented in this video. So at first I was just going to do everything verbally, but then I decided to go ahead and have a little bit of a visual aid, so here you can see I have kind of an outline. So by now, at this point, hopefully you've read the thought experiment, and if not, then make sure that you do read through the thought experiment. So everything that I'm talking about in this video is a response to a thought experiment that you should have read about in the modified step 3 for the week 9 and 10 folder curriculum that you see. The thought experiment is pretty lengthy. It's pretty detailed. I wanted to give you a lot of information to construct a really good thought experiment. I've already lectured on what a thought experiment is, so I'm not going to repeat that information here. What I am going to emphasize is that ethics is in the business of asking tough questions. I've had students say that, wow, why is she talking about George Floyd? That seems so insensitive. When in actuality, it seems to me that we owe it to our concerns for with justice and morality to think through scenarios and questions arising from cases like George Floyd and as motivated by George Floyd and what happened to him. So not only that, but recall. Let me let me turn the camera back over. Recall that at the beginning of the semester, one of the first videos you watched had to do with, well, what is ethics? And you had that guy doing that little like TEDx talk. And remember that he said something about, high schools or high school teachers or high school administrators not wanting to deal with tough issues and controversial problems and questions that students were confronted with on a daily basis almost, if not often. It was almost like they don't want to deal with the teachers, the school. They don't want to deal with the tough questions, the issues, the moral issues, the problems that are arising, That's far from true in ethics and philosophy. We love in ethics and philosophy, we are most intrigued by that which is sacred, by that which is controversial. And so thinking through the morality of what has occurred with respect to things like COVID-19 and the killing of George Floyd is where philosophy really comes into play and finds itself, being most useful and most practical. And certainly in an ethics class. Of course, in an ethics class, we're focused on not only how do we conceptualize and think about right and wrong and on what kinds of grounds can we justify that a moral theory, rule, or concept is one to be followed and endorsed by someone, but we also want to be concerned in philosophy and ethics with real life. In ethics, you have what's called the meta-ethics, which you learned about, the normative ethics, which you learned about, but also applied ethics. And so applied ethics is concerned with or involves applying critical thinking and reasoning skills to real-life contemporary moral issues, along with a moral theory to arrive at particular moral judgments, conclusions about what ought to be done, what would be right, what would be wrong, whether a person would be good or bad for doing, thinking, or feeling something in some kind of way. As such, I do include attention to current issues, even those which are very controversial. Not only that, but high school should help prepare you for life, and college should as well. And so when we use contemporary real life issues such as the killing of George Floyd, we are dealing with the reality. I think it would be kind of odd for me to pretend like in this classroom experience, like there's not a case going on right now, right? We are all aware that right now, Derek Chauvin is on trial for killing George Floyd. So I think it would be kind of weird for me to just totally ignore what's going on. If anything, I think we should be thinking about things that arise out of the killing of George Floyd. And by things, I mean questions, morals, issues, debates, and whatnot. And the killing of George Floyd and the various opinions that are out there about it are there whether or not we address them in the classroom. You see them on the media, you see them on social media, you see it in the news, you hear your friends and family talking about it. Maybe your other teachers, maybe they do bring it up. So we are arising to our potential as human thinking rational beings to think through matters of moral concern. And we're doing it in a way that acknowledges what life is really like and what's going on. Okay, so because the thought experiment does deal with the case of, does have the killing of George Floyd as the background, the context for the thought experiment, you do need to make sure that you are reflecting intellectual virtue, but also, the topic that is brought up, or the character, the protagonist, if you will, in the thought experiment, Roberta, that's also bringing up a whole other set of issues or beliefs or ideas that might be sensitive to some people. And if you think about it, it doesn't seem like there is a topic or an issue that someone might not feel sensitive about, right? So we have to talk about meaningful things in ethics. So I'm going to pick things that are sensitive to some people. So the stuff that is said about Roberta in the thought experiment, that can also be sensitive. But the stuff that is true about Roberta, I pulled from my own anecdotal knowledge and lived experience of what I've learned and know about some people's experiences. It is a fact that some of the things that are true, if not all of the things that are true about much of Roberta's, at least adolescence and childhood, are in fact true of some people, right? So again, I'm pulling from real facts to create our thought experiment. So you'll need intellectual virtue to work through that. Now, why am I saying intellectual virtue? Well, not only because of the sensitive topics, but also because of the intellectual nature of this discussion board. So as you guys know who have been participating fully in the discussion boards, doing the topic responses, watching all videos, working through all requirements, you know that my discussion boards are not formal things where you just kind of state a feeling or whether you agree or disagree, but they are chances to execute intellectual, philosophical moves, to discuss things in a philosophical way. And that's why I always give you a structure and a set of steps and a set of expectations to work through. I had a student email me saying that I did not need to talk about writing an essay because you guys already knew how to write essays. The reason why I bring that up is because I don't know if that student hadn't watched all the videos or if they didn't follow, or they somehow missed it. But one thing that I emphasized in step 8D of the ethics videos, of the ethics essay videos, is that I wasn't showing you just how to write an essay. I emphasized that I was showing you method. I was showing you one method, one way that a philosopher might think through something. So just because you've learned to write an essay or paragraph doesn't mean that you've learned the special, technical, philosophical, conceptual, logical moves that a philosopher might make. So especially in the ethics essay, in the parts that were focused on talking about a vice, two vices and a virtue, that wasn't just about how to write a paragraph or how to quote something and talk about it. I constantly emphasized how I was trying to help you think through certain things in a certain way, in the way that a philosopher might. And then I emphasized that I was also teaching you Aristotelian method with respect to reasoning from the extremes. So just because you've learned to write an essay, it doesn't mean that you've learned to make the special technical moves that a philosopher would, that an ethicist would. And with respect to the essay that was due, it doesn't mean that you've learned to make the moves that a virtue ethicist might make in reasoning from the extremes. So what you're going to see in this assignment, this discussion board, this topic response assignment, like others, is that I increasingly have higher expectations and more requirements, because as you proceed from the beginning of the semester to the end of the semester, if you've been participating in all of the assignments, the essays, the discussion boards, the topic responses, then you should be getting, each time that we get to a discussion board or a new assignment, you should be capable of doing more, better, more difficult things with your brain. And as the research shows, the way that we get smarter and build our intelligence is by creating new brain cells. The way we create new brain cells is being confronted with challenging activities. So this discussion board topic is challenging not only perhaps to us personally and our feelings and our emotions and our convictions about, things like social political justice racism, what happened to George Floyd, police brutality, social protest, and stuff like that. But we need intellectual virtue because of the work that is required to think like a philosopher, like an ethicist, and hence to write like a philosopher and an ethicist. So with that said, you're going to really need intellectual perseverance, right, to make sense of and pull from the thought experiment. You're going to need it to follow the instructions and make sure that you are following the requirements listed. You're going to need intellectual perseverance in pulling all of your cognitive and physiological resources to construct a good argument. You're going to need intellectual courage for the emotional conviction feelings part, and intellectual empathy as well. Intellectual courage is because the reason why I mentioned intellectual courage is because just thinking through this topic might make you perceive that there is some potential harm or threat to just thinking through the topic itself. And so you might feel that your ideas are being challenged or that your emotions are being brought to the surface that make you feel a certain way. So you need intellectual courage to confront and deal with and get into the thought experiment, but also to make sure that in doing so, you are able to express your ideas. Now remember, when you express your ideas in response to the question and the prompt, you have to do so in a way that builds bridges of understanding and not walls of intolerance. So intellectual courage is required in both ways that I went over in a soft talk module earlier in the semester. One, you have to be willing to engage with the thought experiment and all the feelings and emotions, fears, or perceived threats or harms that entails. And then you also have to reflect intellectual courage insofar as you're willing to work through that and to present your views to others, even if you have a self or group created inner fear about how others might respond to what you have to say. And you must be authentic. So do have intellectual courage to be true to yourself, but to be constructing your answers based on logic and reason. Okay. So intellectual empathy. Why is that so important? Because when the thought experiment tells you that you have to imagine that you've gotten yourself into a time machine, and then it tells you that you have to imagine that you're a parent of a 15-year-old, and then you have to imagine that everything in the thought experiment is true of you. So in that sense, we might say that that's social empathy or reality empathy, in the sense that you're imagining that you are that person. But also, you need intellectual empathy because depending on how you respond to the main question at issue, I am going to have you pull from a theory. And you have to make sure that you're representing the theory accurately and not distorting it. And the only way you can do that is if you're using intellectual empathy when applying a theory. Because if you don't, then you may not, and you don't, well, let me back up. You have to use intellectual empathy to make sure that you have a clear, accurate, and precise understanding of the theory you're applying. So when you go to your ebook or to a lecture video to make sure you understand or to pull something from a moral theory, you have to make sure that you are not being biased, that your feelings aren't getting in the way of understanding that theory, that you're not evaluating it. You have to make sure that you're imaginatively putting yourself within the thinking of either Kant or Bentham or Aristotle, making sure that you are really trying to understand things, the morality of the situation or the moral reasons for something within that particular theory, within that system, while watching out for any biases or feelings you might have on top of that. Okay, so let's go ahead then and go on to some other things. So the main question at issue and your options for responding. So there's definitely some structure that I have in mind with respect to your response. If you did participate in DB2 because your topic response was accepted, you'll remember that I did a lecture on argument and what it was that you need to make sure you're doing when you're being asked to construct an argument. So I'm not going to repeat that lecture here. I'm going to assume that you took notes. I will remind you that basically an argument is a set of statements where at least one, a premise or reason, is given in support of a conclusion. So in responding to the main question at issue, you are going to construct an argument. So you will remember that the main question at issue from the thought experiment is, it's a prompt with the question. According to Kant, we have a duty to tell the truth. Would you fulfill this duty in responding to the investigator's question at the end of the thought experiment? So at this point of the video, I'm assuming that you've read the thought experiment, and if you haven't, you'll have to go back and read through all of it. It is long. Do not skim the thought experiment. Do not scan it. If you skim or scan it, you might leave out important details that lead you to construct a response that fails to sufficiently pay attention to context. So be careful with that. So this is the main question at issue that I am referencing in this little outline of this lecture video that I have going on. So you basically have 3 options. Well, so first of all, you do not have the option of how your response is constructed. You have to construct your response as an argument. Not only that, but you have to state your conclusion first, and you have to copy it from one of the italicized sentences below. Now, why would I do that? Well, this is something I've already mentioned, that I mentioned with respect to DB2. That is that when we get to the point of responding to a peer thread, we want to make it really easy for our peers to see what the conclusion is that we're arguing for. Therefore, by everyone stating their conclusion first, we will facilitate that understanding of your peer and their ability to respond to your argument more precisely and correctly and accordingly. I would also like for you to put your conclusion in italics. So the first thing in your argument will be your conclusion, and it will be in italics. And you have to copy it from one of the sentences I gave you. Another reason that I have given before for having you copy a sentence that I give you is that I construct a sentence such that it has enough details in it to make sure that you stay focused when you move on to give reasons in support of your conclusion. It also just facilitates communication or understanding, again, as we're reading through the peer threads. So here are your 3 options. Now, I don't want you to copy the words. I don't want you to copy option A as such. I don't want you to copy, the word option, and I don't want you to copy the letter for the option. What I want you to copy is one of these sentences in italics. And so the options are, I would fulfill the duty to tell the truth in responding to the question the investigator asked Roberta. And so don't eliminate any of this. Do not change it in any way. Copy it verbatim as your first sentence, if this is you. I would not fulfill the duty to tell the truth in responding to the question the investigator asked about Roberta. Or, it is not rational for me to claim a definite position on whether I would fulfill the duty to tell the truth in responding to the question the investigator asked Roberta. Some of you might be saying, what is up with this option right here, and what do you mean it's not rational? Well, I already lectured on that with respect to discussion board 2 when I was helping you to set up your response for that. So I invite you to look at your notes on what I said about being rational and drawing this kind of a conclusion. I won't repeat that here. Okay, so moving on. After you state your conclusion as copied via one of these options verbatim, you will then move on. Oh, and you know what? I realized. Okay, yeah. You will then move on to give reasons for your conclusion. That is, the reasons for conclusion followed said first sentence per the expectation cited below. So there's 2 sets of expectations at this point. There's general expectations that apply to everyone, and then option specific. So of course you want to use proper writing conventions and mechanics, capital letters, periods at the end. No sentence fragments, no comma splices, no run-on sentences. I'm still seeing some of those. Those greatly affect your score. Write at least 5 additional sentences after the conclusion. You must mention specifics from the thought experiment as appropriate. So which specifics you focus from the thought experiment and how much attention you give it is going to depend on the option that you have chosen, the conclusion that you have chosen. And I'll give you some tips and help with that shortly. Okay, so actually I need to do an iteration here. Okay, so must mention specifics from the thought experiment. So one thing that you cannot do is you cannot change anything in the thought experiment. Hold on, I'm getting a call.